Michael Sett of Cornerstone Community Church. To learn more about Cornerstone Community Church, go to www.cornerstonechurchchicago.org.
Today, we'll be continuing on in Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 to 26, with the fruits of the Spirit, or the fruit of the Spirit. As I was wrestling through this and thinking through it, the word fruit kept popping in my head, and images of an orange came up in my mind, an apple came up in my mind, and so I was thinking like orange fruit, and apple fruit, and spirit fruit. And that led into the question, well, what is the fruit of the Spirit? Like an apple or an orange, having their own distinct and unique qualities, the fruit of the Spirit has a unique and distinct set of qualities too. For an example, if you take an apple, it's got a unique shape, it has a unique feel, it has a unique taste, and a unique crunch when you bite into it, and a unique aroma that makes it distinctly and uniquely an apple. When you engage an apple using our five senses, you can tell without a shadow of a doubt, based on those qualities, that it is an apple. So in the same way, when we think of the fruit of the Spirit, we want to think of the unique qualities and the characteristics that make it specific and make it recognizable. In Galatians, these qualities are listed out for us in the form of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. This list gives us a clear idea of how to recognize this spirit fruit, how to identify the spirit fruit, how to label it, and how to distinguish it. Each list of qualities gives us a different and distinct understanding of what makes up or comprises or composes of this fruit, and how to understand the question, what is the fruit of the Spirit? It helps us to test and also to confirm what it is in the work of the Spirit. In the past several weeks, Pastor Calvin has walked Cornerstone through the virtues of love, joy, and peace. Today, I have the honor of sharing in ministry alongside our pastor by sharing my thoughts and reflections on patience. Today, we're going to look at the fruit of the Spirit and hone in specifically from the perspective or the lens of patience to understand its role as a listed characteristic of the fruit of the Spirit and the important impact that it has on the life of the genuine believer. First, I'd like to share that patience is not a quality that is instinctual, it's not natural, and it's not ingrained in us as human beings, as Westerners, or as U.S. Americans. Patience is not the first thing we think of to do for many of us, and when we exercise patience, it comes off a little bit awkward, like we aren't quite in our skin. We're not in our element, in our wheelhouse, and patience is not ingrained in our norms and routines of our societal life. So to explain this a little bit more in detail and help us understand it a little bit more, I want you to put yourself in these following scenarios if you can. You are on the receiving end of a friendly contest of words. You're stumped. If you don't have a smart comeback right in time and a response immediately, you lose. How many of us have been in that situation or watched those television programs where you want to say something, you can't, and you end up walking away while everyone looks at you, and if they're ready to jab a little bit more, they'll go, ooh, burned. And then, at night, after you've done the dishes, gone to bed, had your dessert, you'll wake up in the middle of the night and I know what to say. By then, it's too late. Or think about the time that you're told by some coworkers that the board at your company is planning to maybe downsize, that they're going to have some mass layoffs, How many of us, after hearing this news, will go back and work and continue to work and just wait for official news? Or do we start gathering intel from our coworkers? We start going around the office saying like, hey, did you hear this too? Are you sure you didn't hear this? Let me talk to so-and-so. Maybe they heard something. Maybe you confirm the news. Maybe you go back and brush up your resume. Maybe you start scouring LinkedIn to see if there are any other job postings in your area. You start making calls. You start revising your monthly expense budget. You do something to plan for the foreseeable future. Or think about your response, and if patience is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear that your doctor recommends, some test. It's not that big of a deal. It's still kind of routine, but there's some abnormalities that they want to bring up. Just, from the last normal checkup, nothing to go crazy about. Do we just wait patiently and wait on the experts to guide our next steps? Or do we start asking a whole bunch of questions over the phone that can only be answered after a test has been taken? Do we jump onto WebMD and start self-diagnosing any possible symptoms and trying to figure out and be proactive and stay ahead of the game? If you're like me, when you think of those scenarios, you realize pretty quickly that patience is not my go-to. It's not my standard practice. Patience is not my default mode. It isn't instinctual, and it isn't my response, my go-to response. And also, if you think about it, patience is not ingrained in the way that our society runs. In fact, I would claim that we are so patience adverse that we constantly find new technological advancements to rid ourselves of needing to wait for anything. We order our food through an app on our phones ahead of time so that right when you get off of work, your dinner will be right at your doorstep the minute that you walk in so that you don't have to wait. And then we pride ourselves on how great of a job we did in managing our time, in balancing our schedule. We can't wait for our morning coffee. So instead of looking for parking, turning off the car, getting out of the car, closing the car door, locking the car, walking into the Starbucks, waiting in line for our turn to order and pay and receive our order, we choose the drive-through option. Why wait in the line at a bank for a teller so that you can complete all of your banking needs from there when you could complete all of your banking needs from home? And young people, think about this. Why wait to watch a TV show? Our young people today have just a slight vague concept of what it means to not miss a show because their media consumption is so a la carte. They pick and choose what they want to watch when they want to watch it. I remember being glued to the television for The Office when I was younger, feeling bummed if I didn't time my trip to the kitchen just right so that I could come back. And if I missed 1, maybe even 2 minutes of the show, that was it. I'll never be able to watch that moment again. Today's youth can start an episode at 3 p.m., most likely 3 a.m., and they'll finish it at 8:45 p.m. And if there's a moment that really speaks to them, they can watch that moment over and over and over and over and over again. They can even skip those annoying commercials that come on. Today's day and age in 2020, we have full control. We don't have to wait for a video to rewind, to watch a movie again. We don't have to worry about the dangers of fast forwarding, rewinding, playing and pausing, fast forwarding, rewinding, playing and pausing, that it's gonna ruin the tape. Our society prizes itself on speed, efficiency, and autonomy. There's no room for patience. There's no room for waiting. Let's be honest. Living in such a wealthy nation where we have so much access, where we have so much privilege, it is easy, even for us believers, to lose sight of the unique and special qualities of patience. Also, if I can be transparent for just a moment, patience is not the easiest virtue to talk about or discuss. It isn't something our minds see the benefits of immediately. So for example, if you think of some of the other fruits, and I was looking at this, and I should ask Pastor, maybe he timed it just so, but you think about it. Love produces more love. I get that. That makes sense. Kindness results in more kindness. Check. I get that. Goodness leads to increased goodness. Understood. But patience? Waiting yields more waiting. It doesn't quite make sense like some of the other virtues. We don't see the benefits right away, and it can easily become, if we're honest with ourselves, something that we do because God says so. And we do it out of responsibility, and we practice it because we must. Now, before we answer the question of what is patience of the Spirit and why it's important to have some background knowledge first and offer just a little bit of context this morning. When the first Galatian believers received the truth of the gospel, they embraced the good news with open arms, open minds, and open hearts. The churches in the area established there, they were doing phenomenal. They were on fire for Christ and growing tremendously and thriving as churches and believers. It wasn't until some of the more fundamental Jewish Christians from Jerusalem started making their way into the area and things took a turn for the worse. The good work done by Paul was unraveled by these fundamentalists when they preached that the Galatian believers needed to practice what they preach. That they needed to, for example, be circumcised, and that was the big point, in order to be truly with Christ, and that their works and compliance was required. This new message from those who claimed to be sent from James, Jesus' brother, confused the Galatians, and the churches there were on the brink of falling away from their salvation and faith. They didn't know who to believe. When Paul heard what was going on in the area, he penned the epistles that are known to us today as the book of Galatians to set the believers back on course and to respond to the critics from Jerusalem. In the book of Galatians, Paul addressed issues raised concerns. He addressed the issues that were raised concerning his authority to lead the church, his standing as an apostle, and his teaching on Christ setting the sinners free. People, these fundamentalists, said that he was wrong, and that in fact he was falsely enabling these believers, giving them a license to indulge in all sorts of sin because it would all be forgiven under Christ. Chapter 5 and 6 of Galatians, what we're going to focus on in a chunk, really talks about and addresses these concerns. We find Paul laying out clearly the characteristics of those whom Christ has set free and the way they will carry themselves and lead their lives, in contrast to those who claim salvation but use that divine forgiveness to satisfy their earthly desires. So I'll say that again. In the section that we're looking at today, Paul makes a clear distinction between those believers who've freely accepted Christ's forgiveness and how they are going to live and how they are going to behave, how they are going to carry themselves, versus those believers who have in their minds, or those people, I should say, who have in their minds that now I have a license to sin, that I can do whatever I want and I can engage in whatever I want and do whatever I feel like because I am covered by the blood of the Lamb. So beginning in chapter 5, verse 19, Paul outlines a clear contrast between the acts of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. Paul also makes it clear that the lines are there and that the acts of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit are in no uncertain terms opposed and conflicted to each other. They will not get along. There is no possible way that the acts of the flesh and the fruits of the Spirit can coexist, can cohabitate, can share the same space. A clear, distinct line is drawn between these two camps. So pardon this analogy, but this helped me understand it a little bit more in my modern mind. So pardon this analogy, it's very loose, but let's say that you're invited to a wedding banquet or to a formal dinner, and then you're asked if you want by the people who are serving you, would you like chicken? Would you like the vegetarian option? Or would you like the prime rib option? The wrong way to respond to that question is, yes, please. Okay, think about that. If someone comes up and says, would you like chicken, vegetable, or steak? And you're like, yes. All of them is not an option. Once you've chosen your dinner, you commit to that plate. And all the other options, pardon the pun, are off the table. Hashtag dad jokes. I'm sorry. To all the dads who don't make puns. Only the cool ones do. All right. So going back to Galatians, Paul is making it abundantly clear that those who sincerely embrace the gospel and are truly saved by it will live according to the Spirit. That they will reject the actions of the flesh and list out the distinct qualities of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control as the obvious qualities and traits of the believer's sincerity. All of that smashed the claims against Paul's preaching that he was enabling sinners and giving them a loophole. And instead, what he was really doing was empowering believers to a relationship, a genuine one, with the one true and living God. Paul makes it clear that a well-defined line exists between acts of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. So now, let's talk about the role of patience as a distinct quality of the fruit of the Spirit and the importance it has on the sincere believer's life. According to the reading and the time that I spent researching and really thinking about this, came to the conclusion that patience is defined in Galatians 5:22 as forbearing, long-suffering, tolerant, accepting, understanding of people, even when you're tired and you don't have the strength to do so. Patience is waiting in hope. It's pretty straightforward and direct. Essentially, you are tolerating those who are different from you and have weaknesses that you don't have or have found victory over. That's a distinct quality that is defined for us when we look at the fruit of the Spirit through the lens of patience. Now, parents, I believe we understand this quality really well. Think about this. How many times have we seen parents look at their children in the middle of the night when the little ones come waking you up and saying, I'm sorry, I accidentally peed my bed. I'm all wet. Do you see the parents lecturing their children on mastering their bladders and say things that, I learned to do this, why can't you learn to do this? Or do we see parents instead embrace their children and say, it's okay. I accept you for who you are. You think about this and think about what was outlined earlier when it comes to acts of the flesh. That patience directly opposes or is the opposite of fits of rage. We get it intellectually that patience is a high value and it's a very important virtue. We appreciate it when people are patient with us, but it's a quality that is so hard for us to practice for all of the examples that were shared earlier, and I'm sure countless reasons that are cycling in our brains. Patience is kind of like forgiveness when you really think about it. For example, when you're on the basketball court and you're playing some, basic 5-on-5, and the person guarding you tries to block the ball on your open J, and instead of palming the ball, palms your face. And now it's your nose that's stinging. It's your eyes that are watering. It's your clock that was cleaned. The player comes up to you and says, I'm so sorry, it was an honest mistake. It was just the adrenaline, the heat of the game. And you forgive the person. You're like, that's okay, no worries. Game is a game, right? No harm, no foul. A foul like that happens on the court. It's part of the game. It's all good. But guess what? You forgave that person, but your nose is still red and throbbing. And worst case scenario, you're probably the one that has to spend X amount of time waiting in the emergency room to get it checked out. And you'll probably be sitting maybe 1 or 2 games the next couple of Saturdays while the other person is on his feet playing and blocking some other guy's face. Patience is kind of like the same way. It's great for other people, but there really isn't, if you think about it, very little return on investment. What do you really get out of it when you're patient with other people? That mom or dad still has to wake up in the middle of the night, lose sleep, take off those covers, put them in the wash, and clean everything off. Your REMs were interrupted. See, we love it when people are patient with us, but when we have to be patient, it's so hard because in all honesty, what we're really doing is we're shouldering someone else's weakness and faults and mistakes and shortcomings and failings. However, today, I'd like to share 3 benefits that I learned through my time in Galatians that really motivated me and encouraged me to practice the virtue of patience as defined by Paul in 5:22 of Galatians. The first one is that patience keeps us humble. When we engage in the fruit of patience, we acknowledge that very little is actually in our control. When you tolerate what a professor or teacher might have accidentally said in the classroom, or a supervisor at work has imposed on your team, or maybe a friend did something that was kind of offensive, the act of the flesh demands that the offended speak out and air grievances. When that happens, it's easy to get caught up in the moment, say unnecessary, hurtful words that cannot be taken back. But the sincere believer, when we practice patience and we make a conscious decision to endure the suffering and forbear those offenses, it reminds us that in that situation, it's out of our hands. We so desperately want that situation to change. We want that person to be different, to grow. And we realize all of that work, all those results are out of our control. It's not in our hands. When that happens, it reminds us that we're not the ones to make that impact or change, that we are not in control, that we are not in charge. It reminds us that we are but flowers that are here today and gone tomorrow. It reminds us all that all things are in God's hands and in His sight, that He knows the circumstances fully, and that we can take a step back and wait on His prompting, His guidance, His direction, and His leading, which is so contrary to what our culture teaches us. Practicing patience brings us to our knees in prayers and lifts our eyes heavenwards at the Alpha and the Omega to find our answers. We wait on His timing. How humbling is that? Practicing patience reminds us of God's sovereignty. It reminds us of God's omniscience. It reminds us how very finite and little we are, truly, in the grand scheme of things. So the first one, patience keeps us humble. The second point that I like to make is that practicing patience helps us to understand the nature and quality and character of God. A while back in one of his sermons, Pastor Calvin brought up the concept of time and asked why we need to be bound by it. Some of you guys, I think, were here for that. Mentioned that God travels freely from time, so why can't we? And that question, when I was listening to the sermon, really stuck in my mind for a really long time. And as I was going through this, I concluded that we're not allowed to travel time, because how else would we learn patience? Without time, we can't fully understand this concept, and we can't fully understand the blessings that patience brings. Practicing patience helps us to better appreciate the heart and the intention of God. And here's what I mean by that. When we reflect on our humility and understand that God is right there next to us in all areas of life, in the moments that we want him, the moments that we don't, that he is there 100% of the time, we see a God who sees us at our best and especially at our worst. And I don't know about you, but I know for me in my life, God has not shaken his head in disappointment. He hasn't wagged a judgmental finger at my failings. He doesn't condemn or ridicule me. He doesn't yell. He doesn't tell me how spectacularly I failed. He's understanding and he's patient with me, as he is with you, as he is with us. And as Paul intended in his sermons and preaching, he wanted the believers to understand that Christ came to set them free, because Paul knew that the only way a genuine, sincere relationship could ever be cultivated was not by obeying the laws, but through a true relationship that's nurtured out of freedom, when the believer experiences the freedom that Christ came down, that was given to us by the sacrifice on the cross. And you think about it, in those moments of weakness, that God is patient with us, so that as a result, we will desire a sincere and genuine relationship with our Maker. God doesn't make mistakes. Something else that we need to keep in mind. When we take a look at point number 2 of practicing patience helps us to understand the nature and the character of God, we have to also remember that God doesn't make mistakes, that God has a very discerning mind. God is not in the business of losing. God doesn't gamble or make foolish investment decisions. So with that in mind, when we practice patience with those who also claim to be believers, we get a glimpse of how God sees the members of our church around us. We get to see people through God's eyes. Now, I know that might not be a super big deal for us, especially when we talk about our friends and people who are like-minded and people who are very similar to us. But you know what? It's a game changer. It makes a huge difference when we're talking about those Christians that, and I'm going to be blunt, that we don't get along with, who we don't share the same background, who may have different life experiences, who has and holds to a different cultural identity than the ones that we hold dearly onto. Being patient reminds us that those brothers and sisters that we don't often engage with at our church or know very well didn't fall through the cracks and somehow landed themselves in church, and God's too busy to say, like, you can stay. Our God doesn't make mistakes. He didn't mistakenly, accidentally let that person through the doors of church. See, when we practice patience, when we tolerate and forbear each other's areas of growth, we send a powerful message of acceptance to a world that thinks that you can only get things done with like-minded people, and so I'm going to only hire people who think like me, people with the same degree as me, people who have the same life experiences as me, people from the same neighborhood as me, people from the same fraternity or sorority. That the only way to ensure success is to work with those that only have the way that I think. See, when we practice patience with each other, it helps us understand God's inclusive character. It helps us understand also that God doesn't see people for who they are currently, but who they can become. He sees their potential. And when we practice that, we get to share in that. His good work will be completed in each and every one of us. He is patient with us as we are refined and polished and fine-tuned according to his plans and purpose. Knowing that God intentionally looks at a person's potential, reminds us to do the same. We practice patience in knowing that who stands before us right now is not who stands before us in the future. How could we understand any of this if the Lord did not bless us with the realities and the constraints of time? That waiting for someone's good opens up our eyes and opens up our hearts. That we look forward to that day, that we eagerly await. The third point that I like to share is that finally practicing patience is a very practical approach to manifesting, if you think about it, some of the other fruits of the Spirit. If you're like me, some of us may have been sitting here over the last couple of weeks thinking, really good job, Pastor, really getting a sense of what these elements of the fruit of the Spirit are. But maybe, possibly, I'm sitting out there and you're asking, well, how do I show someone love? What does peace look like? How does that manifest in my life? The answer is patience. When you show the love of Christ to another person, it can take form, take shape by showing that person patience. Being patient with someone is an act of love. Journeying with them, shouldering their burdens with them. We show how powerful our Christian joy is when we're patient and wait on the Lord when we're in the valleys of life. It proves to the world how trustworthy and sure our joy is, that our joy exists outside of the favorable and unfavorable circumstances of life when we are patient. We display the realities of our Christian peace when we're patient with those who are different from us. I would also include that we cannot learn peace without patience, that these two elements are so closely tied together. Being patient is also a concrete, tangible way of demonstrating kindness to others. Faithfulness is proven and tested when we're patient, when we tolerate, when we forbear, when we long suffer. Patience is a big part, a vibrant, genuine, sincere part of the Christian life. And in some way, form or shape, it connects or impacts the other elements of the fruits of the Spirit. So to recap, think that patience keeps us humble. Patience helps us understand the nature and character of God. And finally, patience is embedded and connected to and impacts the other elements of the fruit of the Spirit. So in closing today, for reflection, I'd like to offer up two questions. If the goal of these fruit of the Spirit and patience is so that we can have a genuine, sincere relationship with God, not bound by the laws. My first question is, what kind of life do you want to live? And number two, what kind of relationship do you want to have with God? You have the freedom and will to choose. What will you decide? Let's pray. Our Father, we thank you for your kindness and your generosity, your patience with us. Father, we ask that as we ponder and think upon our lives and reflect on where we are this week, reveal to us, Lord, how we can grow in this area, how we can live out the fruit of patience according to the Spirit. We thank you for just the freedom to sit and be able to listen and to take in your word and take in this time. Father, we thank you for your patience in our lives and how you've shown that to us day in and day out. thank you for this time. In Christ's name, amen.